To begin, I'd like to discuss a statistic with you. According to the NAACP in October of 2020, 32% of the United States population is represented by African Americans and Hispanics. This compared to 56% of the United States incarcerated population being represented by African Americans and Hispanics. So why does approximately 1/3 of our population make up over half of our country's incarcerated population? There's a lot of factors that go into this. But what I'm going to be discussing with you today is mandatory minimum sentences and how they disproportionately affect brown and black people. This topic sparked my interest after watching Ava DuVernay's 2016 documentary entitled 13th. This documentary focuses on the history of racial inequality in the United States and the disproportionate amount of black people in our prison systems. This documentary opened my eyes to the history of discrimination in our judicial systems, and also how our brown and black people in this country were targeted at higher rates not only by police, but by our legislation as well. So first I'm going to inform you on what mandatory minimums are. I'm going to go over their history, why they were implemented, and lastly I'm going to demonstrate to you how these laws have disproportionately affected brown and black people in the United States. So what are mandatory minimums? Mandatory minimum sentences are created by bodies of legislatures such as Congress. They demand a certain minimum amount of jail time for specific crimes. Once that mandatory minimum sentence has been triggered, a defendant's extenuating circumstances will not be taken into consideration. Now you're probably wondering what kind of crimes these sentences apply to. Generally, they apply to drug and gun crimes. For example, if someone is caught with 5 grams of cocaine with the intent to distribute that, there's a minimum of a 5-year federal prison sentence. If, for example, this person was a first-time offender, that extenuating circumstance would no longer be taken into consideration by a sentencing judge. There is a difference in how mandatory minimum sentences are carried out as opposed to other forms of sentencing, right? So typically after a defendant is found guilty, a sentencing judge is the one who decides your punishment. There are guidelines in which these judges follow. However, they may use their discretion based on any mitigating circumstances related to the defendant and their crime. If your crime falls under a mandatory minimum sentencing law, the punishment or prison time is mandated by that law. A sentencing judge can no longer use their discretion to decide the outcome of your case, decide how long you're in prison, any kind of outcome like that. Now that we know what mandatory minimums are, let's talk about the history behind their inception. So, mandatory minimums got their start via the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. This law was put into place under President Reagan, and it was put into place as a means to allocate funds to new prisons, drug education, drug treatment, rehabilitation. This all came as a response to the crack cocaine epidemic that was sweeping America at the time. However, according to The Atlantic in April of 2014, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 in actuality became the primary means of invoking mandatory minimums that targeted those using and selling crack cocaine. So while mandatory minimums got their start during President Reagan's tough on crime era, they continued to expand under President Clinton. Because at the time Democrats were thought to be soft on crime as opposed to Republicans who had a more tough on crime approach, Bill Clinton decided to take that similar approach and platform when he was running for president. He continued Reagan's tough on crime attitude with the passing of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. This law called for mandatory life imprisonment if a felon was convicted of a serious violent felony while having 2 or more previous federal or state convictions, at least one of those also being a serious violent felony. So how do mandatory minimums target people of color? After the institution of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 and the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, incarceration rates in America skyrocketed, specifically within Black and brown communities. When President Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, crack cocaine was sweeping America. It was specifically taking over Black communities. Cocaine, however, had been on the scene for quite some time and was primarily used in white communities. These 2 drugs have the same exact chemical makeup. The only difference is how we introduce these drugs into our body. So the signing of the act put into effect mandatory minimums that gave harsher sentences to those who were distributing crack cocaine. So, for example, according to the ACLU in October of 2006, distribution of 5 grams of crack cocaine carries a minimum of a 5-year federal prison sentence, as I said before, while distribution of 500 grams of powder cocaine carries the same exact sentence. So there's a domino effect of what happens next. As I mentioned, Republicans had been running on a tough on crime platform. Bill Clinton, eager to win, decided to run on that similar platform in 1992. In 1994, President Clinton signed his crime bill, which expanded the mandatory minimums set in place by President Reagan. According to the ACLU in June of 2019, this was the biggest crime bill in history. And it also encouraged even longer prison sentences for gun and drug possession. Furthermore, the act included the use of the death penalty for 60 new federal offenses, some of which were drug-related with no connection to homicide. After the passage of that bill, 74% of the defendants recommended for the death penalty were people of color. In this speech, I sought to educate you all on mandatory minimum sentencing and how those sentences disproportionately affected incarceration rates of brown and black people in the United States. I've demonstrated what these laws do, the history behind them, and how they specifically targeted people of color and subsequently led to their higher incarceration rates. We're in a moment of re-educating ourselves about the history of oppression in the United States, and I hope this information has helped my classmates continue that education.